Hey everybody, Edo here, and I have Seth Johnson with me.
Hi.
And we are here to talk to you about theme in games, theme in design. This was a backer-selected category or topic.
Oh, good choice.
Yeah, it is a good choice, and Seth is one of the go-to guys, at least from my perspective, on feedback on prototypes for theme and narrative and that kind of perspective. So I thought it'd be great to have you on.
Yeah, we've talked before, I think, about how much I love theme in games. I love story in games. I mean, abstract games are great. I enjoy those too, but I really love kind of games that can evoke a story or that give players a chance to really kind of build their own story out of a game. And a lot of that comes from a theme.
Right. And it's going to be one of the interesting things I think we'll talk about in this video is there are some different ways to think about theme and to think about narrative and to think about its purpose and use in games. Mm-hmm. And so maybe we can break it into some categories, though it may be insufficient or we may come up with some later. So one piece of it is really a thematic / narrative hook that allows you to enter a world, a space, story, mm-hmm. and feel like you're engaged and participant in it and imagining it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that very much fits into that storytelling category. I then think there is a second category, which is perhaps thematic components or elements, and it's a little bit weird, but it's the kind of thing where you take a game like Steampunk Rally, and all of the characters you play are the scientists, and they have backstories, and the items or elements within the game are fitting to what their specialty as a scientist was. Or you have objects in the game, like the engines, where the different pieces and components of the engine fit the fiction of the piece. So it's like a steam engine, and it produces water. You put water in with heat, and you get power.
Right. Yeah, that was exactly the second thing I was going to bring up, was that good theming, another thing it brings to a game is it suggests the mechanics, and it helps the mechanics be more intuitive. You understand how they work without even reading the rule book, because you know that water is going to put out fire.
Right.
That kind of thing.
And that's sort of where I think there's this one other, it's probably a spectrum, right? But you have this idea that there's a sort of fictional piece where the component and cards make sense, and then there's this sort of, I'm drawing a fine line, but there's this mechanical thing where conceptually understanding, oh, it's a war, so one side is fighting the other, or, the sword is going to hurt, and just these sort of, they're not even necessarily fictional thematic, it's just sort of like the way the world works theme.
Right.
That is particular to what you're talking about, where you're like, I know what to do now, because obviously, in space, this character needs oxygen, or it will die, or that kind of thing, right?
In chess, you're not going to have a diplomatic solution. You're two armies, you're at war.
Yeah, that kind of thing that gives people and players the ability to sort of quickly understand what's going on. Mm-hmm. And I think those are some of the really powerful ways you can think about theme, which aren't all the way over into like, what's the fantasy setting of this story, right? So in terms of, from your perspective, and I have another video, one of the first videos I did actually on mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, which is sort of a different model to think about game development than mechanics and theme. Mm-hmm. Which I'll link in the description, and you can certainly watch. I think it's very valuable conceptually. But setting that aside, when you are thinking about a game and theme, and a lot of designers struggle with, should I start with theme or should I start with mechanics and that kind of thing, how do you think about it, Seth?
Well, I think you can come from either direction. Either you can come up with an interesting mechanic, like, I don't know, something crazy like, oh, I'm going to do cards, but each card is going to have the face of dice on it. Oh, why is that? And you can start thinking, well, what's a theme that kind of suggests why I might have this interesting mechanic that I'm interested in exploring? Or you can start from an interesting theme of an activity or a world that you're interested in exploring. I think about a game like Sagrada. Did Sagrada come from, I have dice, I want to roll them and set them up in grids? Or did it come from, what's it like to assemble and piece together a stained glass window? And you can kind of, as a mental exercise, work backwards and think, which direction did a game come from to arrive where it's at? I think in the best games,
and sometimes you can ask the designer that question too.
That's true. You can if you're lucky enough to.
No, but sometimes you can tell.
Yeah,
and sometimes you're like, well, I don't know, maybe one way or the other.
Yeah, well, and there's some games where the mechanics can be very solid. It can be a very good game, but you can very much tell that the theme is very much pasted on.
Right.
Other times you can tell there are people who are really into the world they're creating or the story that they want to tell, and mechanics may not be so great.
Well, and I think something that gets missed or not always taken into account, but Sagrada is actually a really good example of it, is you have your theme and you have your gameplay, but you also have your components and your box and your production.
Right, yep.
And if you're able to lace that all together, sometimes you have a stellar event, right? Which I think Sagrada fits into that category where you could have had a dice game that was you're making a stained glass, but not have had these awesome stained glass window components and had the translucent dice,
right?
And done all the things where you're like, oh no, this is like visual or Azul, right? Like where, and that game is almost abstracted of the rest of the theme. And I guess I'm talking about components, but you have this marriage of the thing I'm using feels like the thing it is meant to represent.
Well, another one of my favorite examples like that is New York Slice,
right?
Which I love the game regardless, but I love the fact that when you were dividing up a pizza, you were literally dividing up slices of pizza, and they even went one step further. So not only did they give you a score sheet, they give you a score sheet that looks like a bill you would be getting at the end of a meal.
Right.
They really, the theme really helps suggest that environment in which the mechanics are taking place.
That's actually a fantastic example, and if you haven't seen it, the love that went into like fully executing that idea was through the roof on that one.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways, products that nail where it feels like the theme has sort of rolled throughout everything, oftentimes are products that have a really clear and strong vision or brief or product idea. This is going to be this. And then you start building out and polishing and detailing all of the different parts, the mechanics, the theme, the art, the production, to roll up into it.
Right.
And I think that when you feel or see a product like that, and these are the memorable ones, like which I have a lot of, but like Santorini is another one where that production was looking at, hey, here's this sort of abstract game. How can we know they started with the abstract game because it was an existing game, right? How could we take that, bring in character, bring in theme, and bring in that visual production to really show off this space, this sort of Greek mythology pedestal idea. And it's an example where it's a tacked on theme, but they nailed the powers, and the powers feel evocative of the gods. Where it's just like, move this way, move that way, move this way.
Right.
But you can be like, oh, that's sort of a shady, Hades thing to do, or Hades thing to do, or whatever. Like, so even when you like are forcing a theme, right? Like, and I Gavin can correct me, but like clearly they had a game and they were like, how are we going to make this thing great and appealing and people are going to want to buy this abstract game? What are we going to do to it? And they did some sort of brainstorming, and they're like, what about these characters and mythology, and what should they look like? Should we make it cute or graphic or whatever?
Well, another game that it's been fun to watch is The Brigade, which I know you did a review of that before it came to Kickstarter. It had a really successful Kickstarter, and it's currently in development. And I backed it, so I've been getting their backer updates. And one of the fun things has been they came up with a good game. Like, I was really surprised at how much I liked it. And, you start with a solid game of mechanics of fire spreading through a city, and you're fighting to contain the fire. And they decided they want to do it in kind of a fantasy city. And it's been really fun as they've been, pushing through production, that they are really searching for any opportunity they have to kind of enrich that theme and really evoke that world as they're developing it.
Well, I think shifting to world building is an interesting concept, and it's one that I've dabbled with a little bit. Certainly, The Siblings' Trouble, which is a storytelling game, and has a really strong sort of Goonies narrative feel to it, had a lot of it. Heroes Welcome has a lot of it. But there's always that interesting concept on how much of the backstory and broader world do you bring in? Skull Hollow, which is in development, Seth is working on the narrative on that project. One of the things I was really interested in seeing it do is start building out who are these big monsters, who are the fucks, what's the world, and I remember that first brief you did. You had I don't know if you had a template of questions, narrative questions to ask about a story, but building out all the characters in the narrative, and that helps inform the play and the design. And then there's this other question on how do you then feed that to the players, right? Because it's all sort of secondary to the game.
Right. Well, in the end, it's still a game. I mean, there are an awful lot of game designers. You see this a lot more in electronic gaming than you do in tabletop, I think, who are really frustrated movie makers. Right. They're like, I really want to make a movie, and I want to guide players through the set experience.
Frustrated movie makers who are not game designers.
Yeah, but they forget that players are in control. That in the end, it's not your story. It's the player's story. Right. What happens at the table when you play the game, that's the story of the game. And so I think when you're developing a story or a world for a game, you can have a narrative or something you want to get across, but really in the end you have to remember that you are trying to put tools into the player's hands, narrative tools, thematic tools, so that when they are doing whatever actions play out the game, it's creating and evoking a story.
Right.
When they tell the story of the game, they're telling what they did, how the game played out, and how it resolved should feel like a story.
Right. And there's some interesting, subspaces in here when you think about what are those? We haven't played one in a really long time. The mystery games. What are they called? Unlock. Or time stories, or games that are very specifically trek through a narrative. Or even Chronicles of Crime, which is stellar, right? That game, really you're playing it, but there's very much a thing that happened.
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes consulting detective.
That it's in some ways it's very thematic and it's very story driven, but it's not really a narrative. It's not a space that you necessarily you're not pushing the narrative space. You're just living through it.
Right. You are trying to be clever enough to search through to the next gateway in the narrative and in the narrative world that's laid out in front. And I think that can be a fun experience. I think the thing that disappoints some people sometimes is that it's hard or sometimes impossible to go through it a second time.
Right.
I think of another game like Fog of Love.
Sure.
Where that like Siblings Trouble is a game that's very much built around telling and evoking a story, but because of the tools that are in the box, you can play that game over and over again and get different stories each time. And I think that's one of the things that's fantastic about it. And then I think...
If you want to play it over and over again.
Well, of course. And I have. I played Fog of Love a number of times.
With other people? With other people.
No, I'm sorry. But I think to kind of circle back to what we're talking about, theme...
I haven't played it. No, okay.
You have to decide, what theme are you trying to evoke? And if you're going to have, again, if you're putting those tools in players' hands, making sure that everything hews to that theme. I think if you put, a clunker of a tool in players' hands, it's going to feel off if you aren't properly theming that experience. I'm trying to, if Fog of Love inexplicably had a, auto mechanics card in there where all of a sudden you're doing auto mechanics. You're like, well, why is this in here? This isn't related to relationships and relationship struggles.
And sometimes there's an abstraction between what you'd normally think of theme and what you might think of the experience. Like an example that comes up a lot, which I think is an interesting splitter, is Herbaceous. Mm-hmm. Herbaceous is a game where some people feel it's incredibly thematic because the herb cards are so pretty, and the game sort of has this sort of mellow, casual play that it feels like the sensations and emotions somebody gets when they're dealing with herbs in a garden.
Yeah.
However, for the other type of theme people, it's like this is totally slapped on because nothing you're doing actually feels garden-like. There's this odd shift between people who associate emotions and feelings with theme and people who associate action and mechanics with theme. Like, oh, well, you're just like collecting things and putting them in pots, but that, it doesn't feel like what I would think of as a Euro garden game.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, and I think they're different approaches. It seems like the platonically perfect themed game would come from both directions at the same time. I'm trying to think of Birds of a Feather.
Sure.
Is another great game where it feels kind of very thematic, where the birds are out there and you're trying to say you're moving from location to location and kind of moving around trying to spot the birds. But at the same time, there's a little bit of that emotional thematics, not just of the exploration to see the birds, but also messing with other people who are trying to see the birds.
Right. And Birds of Feather is a great game, by the way.
Yeah.
Small film. Fantastic trick-taking game. Mysterium is oozing personality and the production and that. For me, personally, I love games that have an execution of theme and visual and look that just feels holistic and complete. We were did a Kickstarter preview for, I don't know if it'll post when this posts or whatever, but like for a game called Christmas Lights, which you're just stringing Christmas lights in a row, and you can have a broken bulb and you can contact it, but like the art style of the game is so evocative of like what I feel like is, 1960s packaging of, I don't know that it feels like it's correct.
Yeah.
It feels like it's what it should look like and feel like.
Well, it was also evocative of something different. Yeah. I think part of the challenge, if you're going to do, say, a game with a more traditional fantasy theme, is that theme brings with it the baggage of everything else that's ever been in fantasy. If some people pick up a fantasy game, they're expecting Tolkien fantasy. If some people pick up a fantasy game, they're expecting the fantasy of their D&D campaign.
Right.
And it can be a real fight for you. It's an advantage because people understand, what a fighter is, what a wizard is, what a thief is, and you get some of that intuition that comes with the theme. You don't have to explain why those are different or what they might be different or how they overlap. But it also brings those expectations with you. You have to be careful to make sure that you are either being clear where you deviate from them or playing to them, I think.
And that's actually an execution that I really enjoy when you're thinking oftentimes of the licensed game or existing spaces. I think of Lord of the Rings: The Confrontation, which is one of my favorite games. The way that game makes the Mordor Shire hobbits, like the way Frodo feels like Frodo and Aragorn feels like through the dynamics of play, to me is like blows my mind. It's like, wow, now I understand how that character's motivations and movements worked because of how he was facing and dealing with this situation. Narratively and fictionally, but that kind of thing is super powerful. Where the game produces a parallel emotion in yourself, which feels like the situation might create. Right? I'm trying to think of some other ones. You had that free falling one from that video, right?
Falling. I think when you're talking about theme, as far as starting with an existing theme like an IP and designing from those, you can do one of two things. You can either say, what is the strength of this IP, and how am I really going to evoke that? Or you can say, I'm going to do something so different that people are like, oh, how would I see that action through that? I think about doing a Batman game. Okay, are you doing a Batman game where Batman's out fighting villains and solving crimes using detective abilities? Or if you see a box on the shelf that's like Batman cooking, you're like, how would a cooking game play out with Batman in it? And I think it's a much bigger challenge, but you have that instant hook where people are like, is he got spices in his utility belt? What's going on? Yeah. Actually, cook different things by night and by day, and it could be kind of cool.
Actually, when you said that, the first thing that came to mind would be somebody should absolutely make a Bruce Wayne Enterprise game. Like a game that's not the crime fighting, but just the actually...
It's all about making sure that Wayne Enterprises has enough money to siphon aside to fund Batman.
And so there's just this sync there are these events like, oh no, the Joker's back again. Man, we need more money. How can we fund it?
You got to fund research about that.
Somebody should go
cool.
make the game.
Hey, edit that part of the video. I'm going to pitch that.
What else? But so... I think, just to wrap it up, having... I think it's important when you're thinking about theme and mechanics, thinking about how it's all layering in together and how they're impacting each other is really important. So, you don't just want that sort of bolted on feeling. Think about the narrative, think about the emotions, think about what it means, and then how it's fitting into the mechanics and how those mechanics are supporting it and how that all is clear to the end player. I think if you can draw the line through all of those different things, the overall narrative, the sort of fit and component, the component piece, and then just the small mechanical drivers and forces, I think you'll have something that feels holistic.
Right.
Any other thoughts on your end?
No, not in particular. Yeah.
I think so. Again, if you have any other questions you think we missed or you're curious about or just more pointed, what's your thoughts here? Throw them in the comments. This was sort of a rambler, but hopefully it was interesting. And thanks for watching.
See you later.
Bye. Hey everybody, Edo here, and thanks for watching Gaming with Edo. Reviews over here on this playlist, League and Insider videos over here on this one. Subscribe, share, all that good stuff. But most importantly, play some great games. Thanks.